Hello and welcome to the Black Robe podcast. I'm Carol Mitchell, your host for today. And as many of you know, if you've been listening to the podcast these last several weeks, we've been talking about housing, this essential, critical, basic human need for shelter. And we've been talking about it from the perspective of housing seekers. So the typical average person out there trying to find mostly rental housing and what kind of experience they're having with that housing search process, the barriers they're running into, the difficulties, how credit plays in, how rental history plays in. And then we heard from a housing provider, or what is typically known as a landlord, if you will, who is both a nonprofit housing provider and also a developer. And we heard that perspective. Today, we're going to talk about what the federal law has to say about housing discrimination and try to distinguish fair housing, your fair housing rights, from landlord-tenant rights, which are more a matter of state law. So I want to welcome Adria Buchanan, who is the executive director of the Fair Housing Center of Washington.
Thank you, Carol. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for being here. Should we shout out to Dartmouth?
Yes,
I mean, I want people to know just, how well
go Big
qualified.
Green. Yes.
Just in case, you thought the Fair Housing Center of Washington was not led by a brilliant person.
Well,
not only is she beautiful, she's well educated and brilliant, and
we try.
doing a phenomenal job working to raise awareness of housing discrimination and address discrimination among recalcitrant housing providers who refuse to do what's right.
Yes, there are a lot of good ones out there, but for those that need a little hand-holding, we're here to help create a culture of compliance. So
let's talk about what Fair Housing Center of Washington was set up to do and how you serve the community's interest.
For sure. Happy to do that. So we are the Fair Housing Center of Washington. We serve 23 counties throughout Western and Central Washington. There is Northwest Fair Housing Alliance located in Spokane, and they cover the other 17 counties in the state. But we are responsible for the 23 counties from Canada to Oregon. So our mission really is to prevent, eliminate, and mitigate unlawful housing discrimination and to promote inclusive communities. And so the way that we do that is primarily through 4 avenues. So the first is that we investigate allegations of discrimination. So individuals will call us and they will have their own unique housing experiences, much like what you alluded to earlier. So they're, housing consumers. They could be people looking for rental housing. They could be people looking to buy their first home or their second home. They could be looking to share a house with someone. Anyone who's looking to acquire housing, they may run into a situation that they think is somewhat unfair. And so because we are the Fair Housing Center, people think, well, anything unfair about my housing situation, let me call the Fair Housing Center. And
so is it unfair of a housing provider to expect you to pay your rent?
Right. So one of the things that we have to make clear to our clients is that we cannot help anyone who is behind on their rent. And so when people have allegations of discrimination, which is specifically what we help with, so we have this big funnel where people will call us about all kinds of housing issues. And what's important to note is that we help individuals who have some element of discrimination as part of their experience. So people don't always know that, but we ask some questions. We help them think through what they might have experienced compared to other people in a similar situation to arrive at whether or not there was some element of discrimination that was based on their sex, their gender, their race, their color, religion, whether or not they have a disability, things like that. If it's something that isn't related to some element of their identity, so if it's a situation where we determine they just have a slumlord and that slumlord is treating everyone equally crappily, then that's a situation where we would refer them to some other organization, typically Northwest Justice Project or some other legal services. But if they do have some element of discrimination, we also have to ask if they are current on their rent, because it's very difficult to say that the reason that someone is experiencing some type of negative treatment is because of their some aspect of their identity if they are also behind on their rent, right? Just in terms of being able to craft a compelling argument, it would be very easy to pick apart if someone were behind on their rent. So, in current times with COVID and with all of the moratoriums that were in place and everything, there were some exceptions that were made, but typically, and what we're seeing now coming out of the moratorium is that, again, it's a very difficult argument to make that someone is being treated unfairly if at the same time they owe a lot of money to their landlord. So, so to answer your question, on a day-to-day basis, normally it would be illegal for someone to not pay their rent. They're responsible for paying their rent, and we don't incentivize and we don't encourage people to be squatters. And it's a very difficult argument to make when you get in front of a judge and you're being evicted for non-payment of rent. It becomes a difficult argument to make then that you're being discriminated against.
What about if you are, quote, an occupant in a unit, Adria, which I saw this quite a bit with some of the clients that come to the IBJ. They're not on the lease, but they've been living in a unit for a period of time, and they come to the Fair Housing Center with some sort of claim of discrimination.
Yeah, so it is something that is happening more and more as people, find alternative living arrangements. Affordability is almost non-existent in our state, and so it's understandable that people would try to find roommate situations or other living arrangements, sleeping on people's couches, all of those things. So we do get a fair amount of people in that situation where they are living with someone, but they're not on the lease. And so in those situations, they really don't have the same legal standing as the person who has the lease. And so it becomes difficult because they could claim discrimination, but because they don't have the same standing, it would be difficult to get them any type of restitution or to figure out what it would take to make them whole, essentially, if more evidence came out that proved that there was actually discrimination. And so it's important that no matter who it is, you have to document what's happening. And so if you say you're not on the lease, but maybe there was some verbal agreement, or there was some other, maybe through text message or email, there was some confirmation from the housing provider that you were entitled to stay at that property and that it wasn't considered squatting, or that that you were there and it was an approved stay, then you would have more grounds in the event that there was some discrimination. But if you are living in a situation where you haven't alerted the housing provider that there is another occupant, or if you are the person on that lease and you have someone living in your unit and you haven't notified the landlord, then again, your legal standing, it starts to crumble because you haven't gone through the necessary steps to say, I've let the landlord know, I've put them on notice that this is my new situation. And so again, if it comes to getting in front of a judge, it just becomes a harder argument to make. So
you've got to have clean hands when you come, so that the landlord can't point to some violation of a fundamental rule that you have committed, which sort of throws your claim out based on technicality, right? You haven't paid rent, you have an unauthorized occupant, and therefore your case doesn't even get past the front door because
Right.
you don't really have standing, as strong a standing as you otherwise would. So, Adria, what kind of complaint should come to the Fair Housing Center of Washington as opposed to, let's say, the city's landlord-tenant office?
That's
What's
a
the
great,
difference?
yeah, that's a great question. So the key is this discrimination piece, and it's based on a protected class. So at the federal level, there are 7 protected classes: race, color, national origin, familial status, disability, and religion, and I believe I said sex. So those are the 7 protected classes. There are more at the state level, and then depending on which municipality you're in, there are additional protections. And so if you feel that you have been treated unfairly based on one or more elements of your who you are, what how you identify, then that's a situation where you would come to us, and we would really go through the process of asking a lot of questions, helping you to gather the necessary evidence, coming out to where you are, if that's applicable, talking to witnesses, really helping you craft a compelling argument for what it is that you've experienced. And then we would package that and we would send it off to an enforcement agency. They would do the actual investigation, and then we would serve as a liaison between the enforcement agency and the client. So we would help them think about, again, restitution, what costs have they incurred as a result of this discrimination or alleged discriminatory behavior. Did they miss time from work? Did they have doctor's appointments that they needed to go to? Did they have to pay someone to watch their dog because they weren't allowed to have their emotional support animal? Those are the things that we would help with. Also, if people are disabled and they need reasonable accommodations or modifications, so if they are needing grab bars put in, or if they need more time to review leases because of a developmental disability, things that are on that spectrum, we can negotiate and we can work with the landlord or the housing provider to come up with a solution. So those are situations where people could come to us directly, and we would be more than happy to help them with that. If they are
Emotional support animals,
yes,
those 3 words.
yes,
Let's go back to that just for a moment,
sure,
because that is a hot topic, and I think there's a fair amount of confusion among landlords or housing providers and tenants about what their rights really are and what's the difference between an emotional support animal and a service animal, and are there different rights attaching each of those? Help us out, Adria.
yes. So there are absolutely different rights. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, the service animals are kind of their own class. And so service animals are trained. They're trained to do a specific task. They are allowed in institutions, in government institutions, and they're allowed in public spaces because they are trained. So you'll see service animals in restaurants. You'll see them on airplanes. You'll see them in places where the general public is because they have been trained to perform a specific task. They've also been trained not to accept food or to accept any type of affection or signaling from any other humans aside from the person that they have been trained to support. And that is different than your emotional support or other type of assistance animal. And so it is really important to make that distinction, because people often wonder why non-service animals will be in like the grocery store or in restaurants, and really they shouldn't be. And you'll see now when you enter a grocery store, you'll see signs that say service animals are allowed, because they are. Emotional support and assistance animals, on the other hand, they are allowed in housing spaces. And so it's it's important to recognize the difference, because that's how we keep those protections in place. When people start to abuse the rules, then that's when there's a lot of questioning about, well, why are we allowing any of these animals in any place? And so both for the housing provider and for the consumer, it's important to know what those differences are. So while a service animal, like I said, they're trained to perform a specific task, they're allowed in a lot more places. Assistance animals, they are protected under the Fair Housing Act. And the definition of disability is also much broader under the Fair Housing Act. And so under the Fair Housing Act, service animals are considered support animals. But again, there's also a slew of other types of animals that are considered emotional support or other types of assistance to meet that broader range of disabilities. And so emotional support.
What kind of certification does one need to have? Because, you know, thinking about what our employer or our landlord perspective was, our housing provider perspective was, how do I know if your puppy is just your favorite pet who you love, as opposed to a quote emotional support animal has
Right.
certain housing discrimination rights?
Right.
Because they look the same to me. If they're not a trained service animal, what kind of certification can a landlord ask you to provide for your emotional support animal?
So it's tough because with a service animal, they are certified, right? They come with a special type of training, and so there's a certificate to show that, and they have been properly spayed or neutered or whatever the case might be. They have all their shots. They're really the gold standard, you know, of animal. Whereas under the Fair Housing Act, you have animals that are not certified. They're not trained to perform a specific task. And so it does become more difficult to ascertain what purpose they're actually serving other than just being a pet. And so housing providers, they can require that the person requesting their emotional support animal be considered, you know, a non-pet, and that way they don't have to pay the pet deposit and all these other fees. The housing provider can request that the person provide third-party verification that the animal does meet a specific need. They can, and in that, usually it's in the form of a letter, but that letter needs to document that the person in question is actually disabled according to the Fair Housing definition of disability. That letter has to show that the person making the statement that they need the animal, that they've actually treated that person and seen them. It should demonstrate that they have some type of relationship. It should come from, it doesn't have to come from a doctor specifically, but it should come from someone that is familiar with the client and what their needs are. So that could be, it could be a medical provider, but it could also be a social worker. It could be a member of the clergy or another religious leader. It could be a counselor or a social worker. So really just anyone that's familiar with the situation enough to say, again, that the person is disabled and that the animal is needed, and how many animals are needed, because sometimes people need
Some people
one.
have 2, 3.
Right.
What's enough? What's considered enough? And I will say this, you know, that one of the questions is my tenant disabled? Because, you know, in some cases we have tenants that get up and go to work every day and have no
Right.
physical indicators of disability, but who may very well have a hidden disability. Even some of those would never consider themselves to be disabled. You know, they might have, let's say, an anxiety disorder that their support animal helps to mitigate, but they wouldn't consider themselves disabled, yet they want the emotional support animal there. So how do you how do you balance out those interests? Because technically you are supposed to be disabled in order to even have the emotional support animal, right?
Right. And so that's where it's important to have that relationship with some type of provider, because really if your disability is not obvious, then you need some type of third party verification. And that's just what it is. I mean, that is the HUD guidance that we get, that's the guidance we get directly from the Department of Housing and Urban Development on fair housing, is that if you are disabled, but it's not obvious, then you have to have some third party verification. You can't just say, well, I need it, so you have to accept it. Because really there has to be a nexus between what the disability is and what the person is requesting. So that the letter helps to do that. So sometimes people have anxiety disorders and they need an emotional support animal. But it's important that that letter says what type of animal is needed. So it's not just that they need an animal, it's that they need a dog, or they need a parrot, or, whatever the case might be. It also needs to demonstrate how many. So you ask, how many is enough? According to HUD, there is no number as far as how many is enough. So a person could have 3, 4, 5, in theory, emotional support or service animals. So they might have a service animal that helps them remember to take their medication, or alerts them that they have high blood pressure. They might have an emotional support animal for the anxiety. They might have another emotional support animal that helps their disabled son or daughter with their disability. And so, all of these things can be happening at once, but you just need the evidence to back it up. And also because, again, the definition of disability under fair housing is much broader, and it also applies to temporary disabilities. So people may need something in the short term that they don't need in the long term. And so the letter, again, helps to clarify that. And it really is helpful to the housing provider so that they know exactly what is needed. Because sometimes, let's step away from emotional support animals to like modifications, for example. So someone may say, well, I really need this closer parking spot because of my disability. And they have a third party verification letter that says that, but that's based on a temporary disability. And so maybe a year later, the housing provider comes back and says, hey, last year, this was the situation. You said you needed this closer parking spot. But our understanding was, that was because you were recovering from some surgery. Is that accommodation or is that modification still needed? And then that's an opportunity for the client to say, yes, I still need it, or, no, I don't need that accommodation anymore. So it really is a good checks and balance for both the housing provider and the client to just demonstrate and communicate about what's needed.
Let's talk a little bit about how the proactive work you do, testing, analysis of impediments to fair housing. Tell our audience about those activities as methods, strategies for getting in front of discrimination and trying to mitigate it or address it before it does harm.
Sure. So we talked earlier about allegations of discrimination. So sometimes people come to us, they tell us what their situation is, and they will request that we test the housing provider, or they will give us some indication that maybe there's a pattern or practice that we need to begin to investigate. And so those calls can be informative for us. It can be a litmus test to say, okay, if we get enough calls about this, then maybe we should start to do some testing and see if it's a more if it's a bigger issue, right? If it's a more wide ranging problem for other folks. And so that's one way that we do that. Other times we, through talking with community partners, talking with other, social workers, for example, or people that work with the disabled community, or going to conferences, we'll pick up on things that people are experiencing, and we'll say, That's interesting. I wonder how wide reaching that is. And so then we'll start to design tests around it, and we'll decide, okay, are we going to look at, for example, folks who are hard of hearing? Are we going to design a test around how housing providers are responding to individuals who are asking for touch tone services, or other ways of acquiring information, and seeing, does that present a barrier? Are housing providers actually providing services and following up with folks who have expressed the need for disability related services? So that's just one example, but we try to take all the bits and pieces of conversations that we get and talking to individuals and really formulating, is this something that we need to get out in front of? And so sometimes it's anecdotal, but then also through our testing, we'll see the need for policy changes. And so then that leads into our advocacy. If we notice that homeowners associations, for example, a lot of our calls are increasingly around homeowners association members not understanding fair housing laws. And so we'll think about, okay, we've seen this here and here and here. So now is it time to talk to our representatives about introducing some legislation around, more training for homeowners associations, just like there was a lot of push to get more training for real estate agents around fair housing laws. So really just identifying different ways to do that. And then when we can, backing it up with testing.
And then what's an analysis of impediments? It's one of those phrases
Yes.
that when you're in the business, you may know what that is, but what do you do for cities, counties, towns that help them see more clearly where some of these issues are likely to happen or are happening now?
So every municipality that receives community development block grant funds is responsible for engaging in an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. And they have to do that every 5 years. So what that means is they're really doing a top to bottom look at all of the policies and procedures around housing, what ordinances they have that might impact someone's housing experience. Crime-free housing ordinances, for example, or noise complaints, or abandoned housing, blight, things like that. Anything that could impact housing is looked at. People who sit on boards and commissions that make decisions about housing, looking at the composition of those boards and commissions, seeing whether or not they represent the community, looking at legislation that's been recently passed. Again, looking at how funds are distributed, what affordable housing investments have been made, who's had access to like homeowners assistance programs, for example. Really just taking a very comprehensive look at anything that touches housing opportunity, and then identifying what barriers there are. And when those barriers are identified, then the municipality has 5 years to work towards closing them out. And they report on their progress in the CAPER, which is the Consolidated Annual Performance and Evaluation Report. And that's an annual report that the department, usually it's like the housing department or the community development department, they're responsible for putting that out. And so they report on the progress, they report on what investments in affordable housing have been made, and all of that. And a lot of those reports contain a lot of data about housing, home mortgage disclosure act data, what loans have been made, what bank investments have been made in the community, things about like fair housing, for example, how many complaints have been filed, what the community thinks the barriers to housing are. So usually there's a survey that might go out, anything like that. And so our office, we provide a lot of technical assistance in that area. We will often, municipalities will often reach out to us and contract with us to do those reports. And so if we are not providing data, we might be doing the whole report. Other times we're advising the municipality on how to actually implement strategies to close out the barriers. So there.
What about for Pierce County and City of Tacoma, City of Lakewood, City of Puyallup? Do we have any recent analysis of impediment data that's available
We do
on those
actually.
local? Okay. Okay,
So
tell us more.
yes. So the Fair Housing Center of Washington, we actually did the analysis of impediments for both the City of Tacoma and Lakewood. We did that, I believe it was 2 years ago. I think that was in 2020. We did those reports for Tacoma and Lakewood. And so those are available on the respective websites of those municipalities. I think that, and then City of Tacoma has recently put out a few other reports. There's one on home ownership and about kind of the gaps in home ownership, particularly among Black folks. So there's this. I think the City of Tacoma is making some real intentional efforts to address barriers, right? And so that's why those reports are helpful, because it really helps to gather data and to say we're not just making policy decisions based on anecdotal evidence. We're using real qualitative and quantitative data. We're using feedback loops from the community. We're doubling back to see if what we're observing is actually supported by the data, and vice versa. So I think that that's the best way to use these reports, is not to just have them sit on a shelf, but to say, okay, these are the things that have been identified. So again, if you think about in Tacoma, the tag, there's a technical advisory group on the affordable housing action strategy. And so in the affordable housing action strategy, they talk a lot about not just investments in affordable housing development, but also in access to affordable housing, because it doesn't make any sense to build affordable housing if you're going to have the same discriminatory practices and people don't have the ability to actually live in those places. So looking at that, looking at where housing is being developed so that there isn't kind of an overburden of housing projects, because I think
in certain parts of the city or the county,
right.
You're sort of relegated. Certain types
right.
of housing is placed, and there is some NIMBYism where folks just don't want a lot of public housing in particular in their little, tree-lined neighborhoods.
Right.
And so I guess, maybe we've got to close here shortly, but I just want to know whether or not there are any significant issues that you see either in the city or in the county, a significant barrier that you think is going to take a lot of public influence and activism to do something about.
Sure. So, maybe it's good that we're closing on this, because I think you could go on a long time on this topic. And I know there are a lot of folks who are really committed to closing out the barriers to creating more equitable access to housing, in the county and outside of the county. I think some of the high level challenges that we continue to see is a lack of stakeholder engagement. So really thinking about who the end user is when we're designing policies and practices, and how do we make systems more accessible? How do we make the resources more accessible to people? And how do we do that in a way that they, we meet them where they are, right? And you can't meet people where they are if you don't know where they are. So I think the really being more intentional about the stakeholder engagement piece, and having it be sustainable. So not doing a one-off survey, but really creating a system where you're constantly getting that feedback. I know that there are advisory groups and things like that, but really thinking much more intentionally about how you use feedback and how you collect it. I think that's important. I think also looking at geographically where affordable housing is located. We know that there are racially and ethnically concentrated areas of poverty throughout the county. And in other places throughout the country, municipalities have been sued because they did not evenly distribute the quote unquote burden of affordable housing. And so I think that we need to be more cognizant of where affordable housing is situated and make a more intentional effort to distribute that development throughout the county.
Great advice.
Yeah.
Great advice. I thank you very much for that, for your insights, for your wisdom, for your intellect, for your great Ivy League education that is coming here to Tacoma and influencing our work around fair housing and the availability of affordable housing. Thank you, Adria Buchanan. Let's make sure people get phone number or a website where they can reach out to you if they believe they have an issue that is appropriate for the Fair Housing Center of Washington.
Yes, absolutely. So our website is just fhcwashington.org. You can fill out a complaint form on our website and it goes straight into our system, and we will get back to you. And they can also give us a call. Our phone number is 253-274-9523. So they can call our main line and they can connect with someone, and we're happy to guide them through the process.
Are you still looking for testers?
We are always looking for testers. We really like to keep a diverse tester pool. It helps to it helps to keep our testing dynamic and responsive to the different requests that we get from around the state for testing. And so we are always looking for testers of any age, any background, any technical level. You don't need any experience to be a tester, and it is a paid position. So yes, thank you for mentioning that. We are always recruiting.
Yeah, so if you need a side hustle, if you're tired of dashing and darting around,
yes,
dropping off hamburgers, you could be doing something really important and make some decent money at it. So thank you so much again, Adria Buchanan, and thank you for everybody for listening to the podcast, to the Black Robe. We hope you've enjoyed it today. Hope that it has increased your understanding and awareness of the role of the Fair Housing Center of Washington. And frankly, we hope that you can find fair, safe, warm, and affordable housing whenever you need it. I'm Carol Mitchell, and we will see you next time on the Black Robe Podcast.